vampires. If you couldn't tell by my general appearance, I am obsessed with vampires. I could talk, and I will talk about vampires for hours on end. I am deeply in love with vampires. I am also an English major. That's right, I am getting a degree in a language I already speak. Pick up on the sarcasm. But as part of getting my English degree, I am obviously taking classes and lectures on literature. And for one of those classes, I got to choose a final project discussing a specific topic related to something in our course. So I took the opportunity to talk about Stephen Graham Jones's interpretation of Gothic horror and vampire mythology, specifically within his novella, Mapping the Interior. For this project, I will focus on the Gothic literature genre in general and how Jones writes within this genre, and then I will go into more detail about his interpretation on vampire mythology within the context of Mapping the Interior, and also Carmilla by Sheridan Lee Fanu and Dracula by Bram Stoker, two of the most famous Gothic vampire novels historically. Now, I want to try and define what Gothic horror entails. In an academic journal published by Rebecca Duncan about decolonial Gothic, she talks about the origins of where Gothic literature comes from. Gothic literature really started taking off during the Industrial Revolution in England. At this time, you have rapid societal changes taking place, roles that people occupy, and identities people have are also changing very quickly. This obviously started to scare people, watching how the lines between the upper, middle, and lower classes began to blur. How the environment people lived in started taking on new forms with large-scale factories that had very little, if any, regulation. You can also see the emergence of supernatural monsters around this time, at least in their more modern forms that we recognize them today, like witches and vampires. It makes sense that Gothic stories usually takes place in landscapes that are hostile to its characters in a psychological and emotional sense. Bleak, lonely, and suffocating, kind of like the Midwest in between winter and spring. Gothic literature also relies on the distress of its protagonists, having them tormented by unnatural things or their own pasts coming back to haunt them. Gothic literature focuses on the emotional effects these outside forces have on its characters, showing their fear, anger, sorrow, regret, and suspense. In Gothic literature, it's not just the monster, man-made or supernatural, that you have to fight against. You also have to fight against the very world around you and your own mind. Jones, an author from the Blackfeet tribe, takes this focus on emotions, disconnect from the land around you, fear of an outside evil force coming into your life and causing pain and destruction, the sense of suffocating until you're at the brink of death, then finding some kind of release either in dying or that choking force letting go. And in the context of Mapping the Interior, he applies it to the experience of a 12-year-old native boy living off the reservation, missing his long-dead father and his culture. The basic rundown of Mapping the Interior is Junior, a 12-year-old boy, his single mother, and his 8-year-old disabled brother Dino live in a rundown house off the reservation. One night, Junior sees his father's ghost walking down the hallway, and his initial hope at seeing his long-deceased father bleeds into terror when he realizes his father is slowly killing his brother, Dino. Early on, finding out that his father has returned in the form of what Junior believes to be a ghost, he starts trying to make his father proud again. On page 18 of my copy, he says, quote, "It made me sterner with Dino, to prove the good big brother I was being in Dad's absence, how I was picking up the slack," end quote. Junior doesn't feel much fear at first. He's trying to take this as an opportunity to impress his father, who he never really got to meet. Later on, when Junior is hiding under his house after being chased by wild dogs set on attacking him, he gets a clue that he interprets as his father trying to help him again. Quote, I held my find up. It was Dino's superhero action figure. It was whole now, like it had never been bitten through. I smiled, understood. This is what I'd been telling Mom. Exactly. Dad was here to fix Dino, to help him. I was holding the proof right here in my hands. End quote. When the story starts, Dino has already been suffering from frequent seizures, and at 8 years old, he can't He can't even count to 12. When Junior finds this evidence that his father might have been trying to heal his brother, it gives him so much hope. So when Junior learns that his father is really back from the dead to prey on his younger brother, he obviously has mixed emotions on the situation. When Junior discovers his father leaning over Dino as he's sleeping, his mouth covered in some kind of fluid and his eyes glowing in an unnatural way, he's obviously scared, but he still knows he has to keep his brother safe. Quote, "What I was saying inside, if anything, was to stay away from my little brother, that you're not helping anymore, that I'm sorry. I'm sorry." End quote. Junior then takes a gun he found and shoots his father, or tries to shoot his father. The next 2 pages, Junior talks about his apprehension to shoot his father, how it doesn't feel right, how he just got his father back and now he has to kill him. Junior finds a way to try and process this by reframing his emotions. Quote, "When you died," I told him, like I'd been saving up since I was 4, "I was all crying, you probably know, but it wasn't for you. I was crying because Mom was crying. I was crying because of your sisters. I couldn't even remember what you looked like until the wake. My plan was for this to core him out somehow, but my plan, it hinged on him still caring about us. Really, he only needed us to convert into a future he'd already assumed was going to be real." End quote. This emotional transition between curiosity, hope, loss of faith, and then the realization you have to kill your own father is definitely Gothic. Gothic literature has a very common theme of hostile environments itself, the land around you seemingly working against you. And Jones adds complexity to this by having native characters living off a reservation. There is a common stereotype that is still around today that native people have a type of mystical connection to the land, and that although their ways are primitive, they still have a deep connection to the land around them in one way or another. And it is obviously true that native people have a special connection to the land that they live on. It is often dramatized and exoticized when white people try to portray this within media. But Jones doesn't put this in his novella. He does the opposite. He shows how the land and environment around Junior is actively hostile towards him. A great example of this comes from his conflict with the feral dogs that live in his area. Quote, "But then a rustle behind me pulled my head around. The rustle wasn't the top cuffs of boots brushing into each other, and it wasn't a rattle being held deep in a hand to hush it. It was a dog, standing there, baked strings of saliva coming down from its mouth. The reason it was just standing there, it was that it was probably questioning what it had done to deserve a gift like this, one that was making it slobber all the way down to the ground. I squeaked a sound of pure fear, twisted around, and kicked through the skirt into the darkness under the house. It clawed at the base of the skirt and barked and snarled enough that the rest of the dogs finally came over the fence for what this was. It was me. I'd seen coyotes go after a rabbit when they didn't have anything better to kill. They don't just dig a bit and give up. They excavate until they find a beating heart. I was that rabbit now." Having the feral dogs that live by Junior's house actively seek him out as a type of prey goes against the idea that native people have some kind of magical connection to the land and nature around them. But this also pokes holes into another stereotype held against native men, specifically the stoic warrior. The only reason that Junior is able to come out of his attack alive is because his father used this as an opportunity to take what he needed from the dogs to bring himself closer to a physical form. Quote, "What happened was footsteps crossed the floor of our house with authority, with impatience. Heavy footsteps. And then the door opened, shut, and the first dog squealed. Then the next, and the next, and then that yellowy white head that was pushed under the skirt, it stayed there, but blood was coming from the mouth now." End quote. Having Junior's father come to kill the dogs definitely is Jones defying stereotypes often held against Native Americans. Not only does he actively go against the stereotype of the mystic Indian that has some kind of supernatural connection to animals, but he also goes against the idea that Native men are all super skilled hunters who can take down any predator. Jones directly points out this idea with the internal monologue of Junior. Quote, "This is something all Indians think, I think, that yeah, we got colonized. Yeah, that we got all of our land stolen. Yeah, all that usual stuff. But still, inside us, hiding, no, hibernating, waiting, curled up, is some crazy horse kind of fighter. End quote. This quote is also a bigger part of Junior's character, a native boy who is disconnected from his culture. Growing up off the reservation, Junior doesn't know much about his own culture. Quote, when you grow up in Indian country, the TV tells you how to be Indian, and it starts with bows and arrows and headbands. They are the exciting part of your heritage. They're also the things you can always find at the gift shop, end quote. With his father coming back as a supernatural figure, Junior is clearly interested in learning more about his Blackfeet culture, but he isn't able to learn much while living away from his community. Jones is able to take this fear of lost identity and very other indigenous fears of the land you belong to working against you, not being able to escape cycles of poverty and abuse, and frames them in a way that can haunt any reader, not just native readers. I mentioned before that in the academic journal by Rebecca Duncan, she mentions how the rise of Gothic literature brought in popular monster figures in media since then, specifically witches. But vampires are also an important mythological creature to mention in Gothic literature. I could go on and on. Seriously, I could go on and on for hours about the history behind modern day vampires, but that's not what this project is about. I will say, however, that vampires are a wonderful mythological creature to use in horror, especially in the context of Gothic literature. Gothic horror relies on the fear of the outside, whether that be a physical outsider or the environment itself. And vampires as a type of mythology have been linked to otherness in various ways for centuries. Arguably, the most well-known and influential vampire novel of all time, Dracula, by Bram Stoker, showcases this theme of vampires being used as a type of otherness that people feared. Dracula is a foreign, wealthy man coming from Romania into England for the purpose of preying on the people living there, like two well-standing young white women. Dracula is a supernatural manifestation of Victorian fears. He's a racial other, carrying disease and death with him. He has 3 wives, and defies what people at the time thought a respectable man should be. Dracula is a very clear example of the feared other figure in Gothic literature. This could also be argued for Carmilla in the novel titled after her name. A strange young woman comes into a secluded Austrian castle with a very sheltered young woman, also around her age, who only has her father and servants as company. Carmilla is a wolf in sheep's clothing. She uses her rapidly growing connection to Laura and the privilege she has as a somewhat wealthy young woman to hide the fact that she's preying on Laura and using her body for her own benefit. The idea that you've not only let a bloodthirsty monster willingly into your home, but also that bloodthirsty monster is a young woman of decent status who is slowly draining the life from your daughter as they, quite literally, share a bed together at night is enough to horrify anybody. But in 1827, this was especially horrifying, as Western society started to make its transition from the Regency era to the Victorian era. But Park doesn't take on this type of otherness feared with Dracula and Carmilla. Park died when Junior was a toddler and Dino was only a year old. Junior, a young native boy living off the reservation, getting a majority of his information on native culture from popular media, is extremely eager to have his father back. But Junior's father doesn't just come back from the dead as a type of monster that takes its most well-known form in something from his own Blackfeet culture. Park is forced to spend the rest of his undead life as a creature most people only know from a European lens. Park isn't just a supernatural other coming to try and hurt his own family. He represents a sort of colonized native person. It's hard to ignore the real horror that a supernatural creature brings into someone's life without having that creature be someone you love, like Junior does with his father. When he tries to bring up the fact that he's been seeing his father's ghost to his mother, she dismisses it quickly. Knowing that his mother won't believe him when he tries to explain the supernatural things he's been experiencing, Junior keeps his father's spirit to himself. But there is a question to be posed here. If Junior and his family were better connected to their culture, if they still lived on the reservation, would his mother have listened and believed him? If they hadn't been separated from their community, would Park have been able to get as far as he did with preying on Dino? Like I mentioned earlier, it's not just the fear of supernatural others that shapes Park as a different vampire than Dracula and Carmilla. The fancy dancing outfit Park wears throughout the novella is a clear example of this. Fancy dancing was born out of native people not being allowed to practice their own religions, so they found a way to work around it by dancing for a paying white audience. Sure, those native communities were able to make money and somewhat keep their religious practices alive, but why should they have been forced to do this in the first place? Why should these native people have been forced to put their important practices on display for a white audience who will most likely view this dancing and regalia as a type of exotic practice instead of religious practices that hold importance within their culture? The difference between Park and other Gothic vampire characters isn't just from their positions and otherness, but also how they prey on their victims, and the things they do to make sure their victims stay silent. Carmilla, in her novel, uses constant adoration and devotion to Laura as a way to protect herself. Using her disguise as a respectable young woman who has a deep love for her new friend protects her from being caught until the end of the novel. An example for Dracula is how he preys on Lucy Westenra, who does stay alive for a month until Dracula slowly drains her life, is preyed upon in a way that prevents her from being able to inform the men around her that Count Dracula is the one attacking her at night. By using his supernatural powers to put Lucy in a hazy state, and using his animal form, she becomes unable to point out who her abuser is. But Park doesn't have to rely on building a close relationship with his victims or using a false form when attacking. When he doesn't go after animals or already dead people, he is preying on his disabled son, who doesn't have the ability to communicate his abuse. It makes sense that he would go after his son who won't be able to tell anyone what is happening to him, which unfortunately is often the case in real life. According to the CDC, an estimated 1 in 7 children faced abuse in the past year as of 2024. But that's a conservative estimate, because cases of abuse often go unreported. But a study done in 2022 reports that an estimated 1 in 3 disabled children faced some type of abuse. Park, being a vampire, fits well with his predatory behavior against Dino. With his other son being able to identify abuse, but not being able to see it at first, and the son he is preying on clouded by having his father back in his life in some way. But it's not hard to see how terrifying it is that your own father has come back from the dead, and the only reason he is visiting your family again is so he can take whatever he wants from his son without caring about the consequences. This can tie into the fears each vampire represents. Carmilla represents the fear of the corruption of an otherwise pure and sheltered young lady. Dracula represents the fear of a foreign figure, one who defies strict societal standards of the time, coming into Western society and attacking their way of life. Park represents the fear of a figure that is believed to be trustworthy, someone you hope and believe is trying to help you, especially in the case of understanding your already fractured sense of self. Someone you think is on your side, really being on the side of the people harming you, and using your trust for their own gain at the expense of others. All throughout the novella, Junior speaks of how he believes his father is back from the dead to heal his brother, to put his family back together, to help him connect with his identity. But when Junior really learns why his father is back from the dead, he feels crushed. Park isn't just a representation of figures you should be able to trust being untrustworthy or being undead in the world of the living. He represents the fear Junior has that he will never be able to connect to his culture again. A constant reminder that the only way Park was able to be a fancy dancer like he always wanted to be was by coming back to life and preying on the vulnerable. Quote, "He was going to be the best dancer of us all, once he straightened back up again," one of his sisters had told me. I think she was saying that if my dad would have applied the same energy and forethought to his regalia and his routine as he did to what trouble there was to get in once the sun came down, there would have been no stopping him. End quote. Park is back for the whole reason of moving on, doing things in his undead existence that he couldn't do in his life. Park is able to break away from the poverty and cultural disconnect that Junior can't escape. Junior doesn't fear a racial or sexual other coming into his life and disrupting his ways. He fears not blindly loving his father and never being able to find his own identity in life, which Park, being a vampire, perfectly represents. From the hostile environments and crushing emotions of Gothic literature to vampires used as stand-in for fears and predators, Stephen Graham Jones has a very interesting interpretation on Gothic literature and vampire mythology. English literature, and literature in general, has been a white, male-dominated field for a large part of history, and when white women did start writing Gothic fiction, it was heavily criticized. Jones is able to bring his Blackfeet heritage and common fears held by the Native community in mapping the interior in a way that haunts the reader long after finishing the novella. In just 108 pages of a novella intended for a young adult audience, Jones challenges stereotypes about Native people, exploring themes of lost culture and identity, complicated emotions that come when learning someone you deeply admire is actually a predator, and other complex themes that makes the reader feel like they're being slowly pulled to the edge of a high cliff. And every time you feel like you've reached the edge of that cliff, it just keeps getting higher and higher up until you're finally able to drop down with relief.